Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Volleycast. Long time no podcast. To all my literally dozens of fans out there, sorry it's been so long since I had a podcast. Clearly, with all of the events going on in the world right now, you're all dying to hear my voice talk about obscure volleyball topics. Well, maybe some of you are. Been doing a lot of sessions, remote training sessions with clubs, and really doing a lot of these Saturday coaches workshops. They've been going really well. Had some awesome guest speakers on there. Just recently, we had Brittany Dildine from Wisconsin, Ryan McGuire from Baylor, Jalen Reyes from Nebraska. That was on this last Saturday. Session's been really good. I've been learning a lot. I think I've been getting some great feedback from the attendees. They've been learning a lot. Really, what I'm doing is scratching my own itch, talking to the coaches that I want to learn from and I want to talk to. And it seems like a lot of you do as well. So that's just been really great. And this weekend, talking with Danny Busman-Kelly from Louisville, talking about setting and running an offense. And next weekend, talking with Lucas Labe from USA Women's National Team, and then soon to be, well, I guess already head coach of NC State, but really taking over on the court come the fall. So we're talking about block and defense and what he's planning on translating from USA Women's National Team to NCAA, what's going to stay the same, what's going to be different. And that topic is kind of relevant to an issue I want to talk about tonight. It's sort of a follow-up question from Jalen's webinar. And a coach asked, based on your experience in coaching different levels of women's volleyball, how big of a difference in player ability are there between international, Division I, Division II? And he said, I asked this because I had some good takeaways from this weekend, but I'm curious what I need to take and put into the context of Division II volleyball. And I think that's a great question, and that's something that I think as coaches, we're always thinking about. And I get asked that a lot. You know, I've had just really the great blessing in my coaching career to have worked at, I feel like maybe the most broad coaching experience regularly of maybe any coach that I've ever met. Because I started coaching club volleyball, high school volleyball, and all middle school volleyball. It's not really that out of the ordinary, but it's a little out of the ordinary, I think, for coaches who end up coaching maybe international level volleyball for a national team. You know, if we look at the other coaches that are generally on national team staffs, we see often players who are great players themselves. Look at Karch and John Spiral, and maybe players who have people who have a lot of experience. Maybe they go right into being a GA at a big school and then sort of become an assistant and sort of work up from there. But starting at the high school or club level is not super unusual. I think maybe what's different for me is that I've stayed in that world even after I was part of the national team staff in 2013, 2016, including Rio Olympics. And then after that, I decided maybe not to stay full-time with the national team program or go full-time into the NCAA. Basically, make a decision that's been terrible for my bank account, but great, I think, for my overall life and coaching experiences. Just sort of this nomadic consultant coach, been all over the country, all over the world, really, and coaching and working with all different sorts of programs. So what it ends up with is like 1 week I'm in the national team gym, like this last summer, I'm working with Canadian, one of the assistants with Team Canada, women's national team there. And, during the season, my wife was pregnant. So we actually went home, gave myself paternity leave to go home and have the baby at home. And sort of while we were in that, I worked with a high school program for a week-long camp. So it's like going from a gym, national team gym, to then like a high school gym in the space, pretty soon. And I do that kind of stuff all the time, really, is because what I love. I love all the different levels of volleyball. But I get asked this a lot. And, I've experienced on the men's side and the women's side, something that we've tackled in some of these podcast episodes before. Dave and I did a good podcast. It was like episode 25, 24, something like that, where we talked about men's game and women's game and how that influences. I think all of it differences. And one of the things that we talked about there and difference between men's and women's game is it's kind of the same principles, and you might know some broad differences, but then it all comes down to the individual application. And that's what I would say is what I see between, Division II, Division I, international, et cetera. The principles don't change, but the applications change a lot. Who we talked about in one of our podcasts with Andrew Strick when he came on, as players, they get better, they tend to automatize certain things so much. They may misattribute what is important, something I think that you have to be aware of. Some of the details that you really have to focus on with high school kids, for example, they're important for international players, but and sometimes they've internalized them, or they've internalized the basics and they're focusing more on the nuances. And is what you could maybe kind of think about. It's like climbing a mountain. The bottom still has to be there, but you're focused more on the peak than you were where you started. I think a lot of times there's a lot of value in coaching less skilled players, and especially I'm talking about like if you get a chance to coach 12 and unders or something like that. Elite players, especially like athletes with elite physicality, sometimes they can almost seem like they can make anything work, at least in practice. And when you go out and compete against a similarly talented team, you find out that it kind of takes what it takes, and there's actually less solutions available as you get up higher. But I think there's such instantaneous feedback when you coach average humans as opposed to international level volleyball players. You give them some feedback and it's just like, nah, didn't help. You'll see it so obviously. So I actually think it's just great for your coaching if you can coach a mix of levels. But it's like 1 + 1 always equals 2, whether you're learning it in first grade, whenever you learn that, or you're that's foundation that's built upon and you're using it in advanced calculus or something else like that. Is the fundamentals don't change, laws of gravity don't change, how the ball bounces and rebounds around the court, that doesn't change, but all of the applications always change because they change even amongst individual teams at the same level, individual players on the same team. I think one of the biggest things is that the physicality change the tactics. So here's an example. Look at it blocking. If you're a high school coach, you have to kind of decide, hey, do I want this player to even block at all? And you might not want all 6 of your front row players to even block. You may have a player who plays in the front row because maybe she's not a bad hitter, or maybe she's a good setter, or maybe you just don't have anybody else. But, if you're a high school coach, you may have a player in the front row who will never block a ball all year. She tries, she jumps up only a couple inches above the net. And you may just not want to block with that player at all because their physicality is a limiting factor in just what you can do tactically. So you're just going to pull off and cover some tips, and that's fine. We can still play fine defense around that at the high school level. The collegiate level, it'd be rare to see that, where you have a player who's just like kind of incapable of blocking. Maybe there's been a setter or two, but especially at the NCAA level with substitutions, it's unlikely to happen. But you may have a decision like, hey, do I want this smaller setter to bunch in and help on the quick and then recover to the outside? Or are they just going to be permanently in a leave and they're only worried about blocking the outside because they're not really physical enough to help and then try to recover to the outside, which always takes a little bit off your block jump and all of that. It's like, okay, they're just going to leave, go block the outside and just go max jump, and be able to give some kind of presence there. So I think that's something that we want to be aware of. The principles of how you actually make the block move are basically the same. They just are more or less relevant or more or less available depending on the physical differences that you have. And your opponent's physicality also really matters. So that's something that changes from level to level. When I coached club level volleyball, I coached a pretty good club, national, pretty nationally competitive team. Maybe at the U17, U18 level, I still never had my players block against back row attackers. And we played some hitters that would go on to become NCAA All-Americans who played against a few of those players. And even then, at the at the club level, we weren't blocking. They still really weren't effective enough to warrant a block. And what I mean, well, maybe what I mean by that is our block was still going to do more necessarily harm than good, because they were not so terminal that our diggers couldn't dig them at the cost of getting tooled extra and not being able to see the hitter because the block is sort of in the way. So that was a factor. When I coached at Loyola Marymount University, a competitive Division I school, we're at the NCAA tournament. West Coast Conference is pretty strong. RPI, I don't know, whatever we were in the 40s, something like that. So top 50 team. We didn't really block against back row attackers. And because of the physicality of the opposing hitters, generally at the NCAA level, especially sort of mid-major NCAA level, they weren't so terminal that they couldn't be dug. And then when you add in just the factor of your own blockers and the fact that, yeah, they'll get some blocks, but not all that many, et cetera, et cetera. And when you look at the NCAA Final Four, Division I Final Four, so there's kind of a gap between like top 50 and Final Four, there's some players you better block against. If you were coaching the NCAA tournament this past year, blocking against Cat Plummer, Yassiana Presley, and you weren't blocking them at all in the back row, that's probably a recipe for disaster. Now, maybe there's some situations where you want to block them, but you're going to go up and block against those players. And international, yeah, you better block the back row attack. Yeah, they're going to be super terminal. So that's something where, like, the principle to me is the same. Block when your block can help you, and don't block when your blockers can do something more productive and when you can dig the ball. But the application is pretty different. And it can also become so different that it almost is categorically different. Like, you can just tell high school players categorically don't block an attacker when they're 8, 9, 10 feet off the net, even if they're a front row attacker and the set is that far off the net. High school level, generally just pull in and don't block. But that doesn't, as you go higher level, then it kind of categorically changes from never do this to, oh, maybe now we have to do this against some players and not against other players, to now we always have to do this. So, those physical differences. I'm also thinking about, like, on the offensive level. On the offensive level, international teams, pretty much across the board. I'm talking women's volleyball here. You're running, certainly men's volleyball too, but you're running like a true 4-step quick, pretty much across the board international, like maybe like a 0 tempo is what you call it. They may be off the ground, or they may be just like at toe off the ground. Quick hitters are generally not like in the air as much, I think, as coaches think they are when you actually look at stop video. But for sure, international volleyball, the quick is really fast. A lot of collegiate players would be served, and teams would be served by going a little slower. Certainly high school. Think something like a 2nd-step quick, like, you might call it like a 2-ball, like maybe not a moon ball, but like a rhythm 2-ball is really good for a lot of high school players, because the setters can set them and the hitters can hit them. And even like Division II, even Division I hitters can be served by a slower quick, like a 2nd or 3rd step, like a 1.5 type quick, like antenna height. A good example. There's some teams, BYU, University of Washington. University of Washington with Liana Sabeldin set hitting efficiency records, hitting a 3rd step like a 1.5, because the setters can set it better and gives the hitter a little more range to hit. And physicality of the opponent now. Opposing blockers aren't good enough to take away enough court from you. The international level, they are. So it's not that like 4th step is better than 3rd and 3rd is better than 2nd step. And it's like you're trying to go up. It's more like at a certain level, high school volleyball, pretty tough to really do a 4-step quick, because the setters aren't good enough and the hitters generally aren't big and athletic enough to do it. So it's like almost like a reduction of options there, which kind of maybe going along to the next point you can think about is like the higher the skill level, the higher the level of play, you have more options. It's not necessarily good. I think that I just have definitely seen coaches coaching at higher level teams, and they can get kind of sucked into the minutia of, and it's almost like not analysis paralysis, but like, the paradox of choice. When, you have so many things that your players could do, you can sometimes forget to focus on fundamentals. It's always going to be the determining factor. Sort of thinking about this, like maybe as it relates to offense. you're coaching a typical high school team, not like a really, really good high school team, but sort of like an average high school team, probably just setting fairly high sets across the board, even in the middle and on the outside, just trying to get a good approach and get a good swing in the court. That's generally successful in high school volleyball, and certainly lower than high school, U13, U14. At that level, teams aren't really playing against the other team. They're sort of both playing against the net and the court and the ball and all that. If you're playing U13 volleyball and you hit in and serve in more than the other team, you're probably going to win. That's not necessarily the case at the older level. And to the degree that it is the case, it's largely because both teams have a level of fundamental mastery. So it's like in lower levels, teams aren't really playing against each other. They're both sort of playing against the net. And as you go higher and higher level, you're playing against the other team. You're really playing against the other team. Some examples of this: 2019 National Championship, Stanford, Wisconsin. They only had 12 unforced hitting errors on over 200 attempts between the two teams. That's hitting the ball in a lot. So all teams at that level can hit in. Now you have to be terminal. And here's an example of it I really love. There's quite a few good examples, but 2018, Elite Eight, BYU played Texas. They made 9 unforced errors and got blocked 15 times. So that's making the other team play, making it like that's not hitting out a lot. That's like attacking the block. And you'll see that Ryan McGuire talked about that. Dan Fisher talked about that in his presentation, basically just like going for it and making the other team have to block you, because that's not handing them the game. And a lot of times the other team's blockers aren't going to be good enough to do it. High school level, it's not uncommon for a team to score to get more unearned points. So that's the other team's errors: hitting error, serving error, ball handling error. Then they get earned points: kills, aces, and blocks. The U13 level, that's actually almost always the case. If you look at U13 volleyball, the other team scores more points for you than you score for your team. Again, you're not playing against the other team, you're both playing against the net. At the Olympic level, you might only have 3 or 4 unforced errors by the other team in a set, maybe a couple more. You can expect to have to get 15, 16, 17 kills in a 25-point set, plus a few aces and a few blocks to win a match. So that's one of the big things that really kind of changes. There's an expectation of fundamental skill mastery as you go up. Maybe in U13 volleyball is 100% fundamentals, 0% tactics, essentially. Maybe high school volleyball is 90-10. Maybe Division II volleyball, maybe it's 80-20, 70-30. Maybe high level NCAA volleyball, maybe it's 70-30, 65-30, whatever it is. Maybe international volleyball is inching closer to 50-50 split between fundamentals and tactics, deciding the outcome of the game. But I think that even at the highest levels of the game, the fundamental skill mastery is always the most important thing. Just tactics they go from irrelevant to relevant. So that's something that you have to kind of think about. Think about how that applies to something like setter distribution. U13, you don't have tactics. Your setting distribution is whatever the setter can set. Set the closest hitter, just get a ball up and let somebody take a swing at it. High school, you start to have some tactics, and a lot of times your tactics in high school are get the ball to your best hitter. And it's tactical is technical, do you have the capability of setting the outside hitter even when you're going backwards or off the net or something like that, or whoever it is. Then it's at lay level. It's, hey, what are we good at doing? What are they bad at defending? And what's the Venn diagram overlap of those two things? So those tactics become relatively more important. Like I said, they're never number one, but they become relevant as you go up in levels. All of the technique, I think, is really similar. Just some of it's not as important as you go up in levels. I don't know if this is a big difference between Division II and Division I. Maybe a little bit, but it's, here's what I'm saying. Even 12-year-olds can learn to pancake dive, sprawl, overhand dig. Can look pretty much the same way that an Olympic player will do it. Not all 12-year-old kids, but certainly some can execute a diving dig, and it's basically the same exact technique as the Olympic player do. They can do an overhand dig, basically same technique. Another player can just do it way faster, more powerfully, more accurate. Even young kids can do the same block move. They can basically do the same footwork. It can really all look the same. But because of the differences in power of execution, some of these moves are relatively more or less important at different levels. I think it's something like a crossover 2 blocking move. Instead of having the time to take the full 3-step swing blocking move, you just sort of 1, 2, and jump off 1 foot and kind of drift into the seam. Look like a high school volleyball, it's relatively unimportant for average level high school volleyball. I'm not talking about the best teams in the country that you're looking closer to a collegiate level game. Just talking about like an average high school. So you might have a 5'7", 5'8" middle and maybe average athleticism. It's a typical high school varsity middle. She's never going to block a ball doing a crossover 2 move because she can't get up over the net unless she's got both feet under her to jump off of. So your higher level middle, who's generally bigger and more athletic, that the crossover 2 move is valuable for her because she's big enough to still be above the net. And there's sort of like this tipping point between getting like 2 inches above the net where you're never going to block a ball, essentially, and being a 1.5 feet over the net. At that point, once you're at like 9 feet, you don't need to get any higher. You just need to get further over. And you need to get over at the right time. So that crossover 2 blocking move is really valuable for the higher level middle, but it's irrelevant for most high school middles. And even if this high school middle could do it and still get over the net, it's unlikely that the offense she's playing against is fast enough to need a crossover 2. You need a crossover 2 against a fast in-system offense. She's probably not facing that. So that's something where it's like, yeah, you could do it, but it's just sort of irrelevant. Thinking about another defensive move like a no-step sprawl, where there's a hard-driven ball sort of right at your feet. And we see these really high-level diggers. They just sort of put their platform on the ground and sort of shoot underneath the ball with no steps. They just kind of like drop and slide underneath. Some people call it like a knee drive, something like that. Different names for it. We've seen some coaches. We saw Jalen talking about some of these moves with his Nebraska diggers. We saw Brittany talking about them with some of her Wisconsin diggers a couple of weeks ago. That's a really important move for high-level defenders. It's not that – and well, let me back up for a second. It's a really important move for high-level defenders. And you can get some 12 and 13-year-olds to do that move pretty well. Like you just rep it out. You kind of stand on the side, stand on the box, whatever, kind of you put it right there. They can physically do that move like really pretty well. But it's sort of irrelevant because at their level of play, they almost never really see a ball hit hard enough to really warrant that move. So it's like you're doing more moves like a step and cut or a more extended diving move, to cover more court. Those moves are more relevant for younger levels. I don't really see that as too different between like Division II and Division I, something like that. At that level, hitters are hitting the ball hard enough to terminate. What's interesting that if you even go like higher level, the move starts to almost become irrelevant again because the ball's hit so fast, you almost don't even have time to execute that no-step sprawl. And instead, like you look at like Olympic level men's volleyball, they're not really playing for that dig on the floor. A lot of times they're trying to step in and even taking them off the chest because like now the ball is hit so hard that move becomes less relevant again in favor of more like one arm, like stepping in, taking off the chest, one arm digging, that kind of stuff. So that's something to think about is like the physical, like all the technique can pretty much be done the same way, regardless of what level you're at. Just the power differential makes some techniques more relevant, make some techniques less relevant. I think the final thing, I think this is a really important topic, maybe worthy of a whole podcast itself, and maybe I'll touch on it now. Maybe I'll get Dave's opinion on it or something like that. I think the seeing and the reading and the autonomy is just as important in every level. And I could see there were, Jalen really emphasizes that in Nebraska. Like a lot of, he was saying was like, well, we're not going to script it for them. We're just going to teach them how to read and react. We're not going to tell them, oh, when the setter goes here, you have to go there. When the setter goes there, you have to go here. We want to teach them the general principles and then just see and react and all of that. And I think there's always a little bit of a reaction from some coaches is like, well, yeah, but my players aren't good enough. Hey, I mean, I get that for Nebraska, but like my girls aren't good enough to just like see it and do it the way your girls can? And like, my answer to that is like, yes, but. So as coaches, we always have to be aware that there's problems we can't fix as quickly as we like. The quote that I heard is like, people overestimate the effect of a coach in the short term and underestimate the effect of the coach in the long term. You know, you could give the world's greatest coach, you know, a high school team, and you could give anybody off the street, even whatever, to coach the Olympic team, and the Olympic team is going to win 100 times out of 100. There's nothing that coach can do to eliminate that. But like over time, a coach can have a huge effect. So what I mean, so circling back to this, is like a lot of times we want to like overcoach to make up for a deficit that we see in the moment. And sometimes that's appropriate. That's, you know, it's the fifth set and it's 13-13. And if you need to tell a player, hey, I'm pretty sure that they're going to hit the ball here, go stand over here. Yeah, okay, then that's kind of doable to help them through that moment. And that's part of what we're there. But like when we have a good team, there's always more trust and autonomy. And when we have like a not as good team, we always feel like, well, that's all well and good for this team who's better than mine. But to have this autonomy and freedom to react, but my players aren't that skilled. But we feel like that at every level. And I've seen it work for players at every level, and I've had those conversations at every level. So I coached U12 volleyball. And when I'm coaching U12 volleyball, I can remember, you know, I always say this is just a great learning season. Coaching club and coaching with my sister, running the club together. And we had a kind of a group of about 20 12-year-olds. So, okay, we have 2 12 and under teams. And we were both also coaching older teams. I was coaching like 17 and under, maybe she was coaching 14 or 15 and under, something like that. So we're going to kind of like co-coach both these teams together as it fits around our older team schedule. And like a lot of times you have a 12 and under, they all practice together. We coach them together. So it's like really like all the same practice, all the same training. It's a really integrated group. And the 12-1 team, like, well, so, you know, then we'd split them up for appropriate levels for tournaments. So the group that we'd have be like the 1 team for the tournaments, they're killing everybody. You know, they were a really good club team for their area. And, you know, they're winning all these tournaments they're playing in, and coaches are coming, oh, wow, how do you get them to do that? You probably don't even barely need to coach these girls because they know what they're doing and all of that. And then, you know, you take the 12-2 team, and, you know, the 12-1 team is girls that they're 12 and they've already been playing for 4 years because they have an older sister and they're biologically more developed at that age. And the 12-2 team is like half of them are 10 and they've never played before and they're underhand serving and they're late bloomers anyway. So it's like, yeah, then you go to that tournament and the other coach is like they're like giving you advice after, like, hey, have you tried practicing serving? It's like, yeah, they're just not there yet, you know? So it's like at 12 and under, you'll get that. Oh yeah, like I get that you can just have those girls. They can just go out there and they can just know what to do. Well, my girls, I can't do that. Well, yeah, but if you took those quote unquote good 12 and unders and threw them in a 17s tournament, threw them in a 16s tournament, they wouldn't look so great anymore. They'd look out of their element. They look out of their depth because it's a relative. Same thing at 17 under. I remember coaching my under 17s team, and I was at the, you know, like the regional bid tournament, you know, the regional championship and all that. And we're doing well. We would eventually win it. And in pool play and doing well, coaching them how I would normally coach them. And you know, which means I'm not standing up there ranting and raving. You know, I'm intense, but I'm not ranting and raving. You know, trying to have a lot of autonomy. I'm not coaching over their back from the sideline because, you know, you coach them hard in training, and then in games they need to execute, and they need to communicate with each other like that. And you know, I remember calling a timeout, and as we did it, you know, at first they would huddle together for a few seconds to talk, and I would talk to my assistant coach to give them, you know, to give the captain or the setter a chance to talk about some things, or, you know, before I went in the huddle. And the coach who was doing the work team was like, yeah, I guess you barely even need to coach these girls or something like that. And I said, well, that's because we're playing a team. Oh, I didn't say it. I just said, oh yeah, you know, kind of took it as a slightly backhanded compliment. But, you know, in my head I was thinking, well, that's because we're playing a team that right now we're better than. So yeah, of course we look good. If we took this team and Indeed, we had some matches that year where we played teams that were clearly better than us, like the really top of the top teams in the country, clearly better than us, and we looked a little lost. And yeah, they had autonomy, and they used that autonomy to make the wrong decisions because they weren't quite good enough yet. Same thing at the collegiate level, same thing at, now saw with, in Canada and USA, the difference between some of those national teams. Even those are elite players in Canada, weren't quite as elite at USA yet, yet. So there were some things where it's like, well, if we just tried to overcoach them right now, maybe it would feel like I was making them better in the moment, but maybe not. Maybe not. Just because we tell a player what to do doesn't mean they can do it. I can follow the same recipe as one of the chefs on, Top Chef or where you see these master chefs. We can both have the same recipe. We can be told exactly what to do, but the result is going to be different. And that result is the years of training and craftsmanship and getting better, and probably some natural talent, and probably some early childhood development, and all of these things. It all factors into it. So I think that level of autonomy, principle of appropriate autonomy and desire towards mastery and having some degree of self-direction, I think that applies at all levels. I think it does. And I think that we don't want to get too caught into the relative. Hey, are they good enough? Or are they good enough to have autonomy yet? Because you're kind of always going to feel like no, in a way. And so, a few thoughts there on coaching different levels and what the differences and what the similarities are. So, that's it. I wrote up a blog post. Actually, I'm split it up into two parts on the Scout VB website, which is sort of irrelevant because you've listened to the whole thing now. So I guess I probably should have done this at the first, but I am a terrible internet marketer. But hopefully you found some of this enjoyable. And like I said, workshops coming up. We got Danny Busby and Kelly this week. We got Luca Slabe next week. Got a couple other coaches that I'm trying to lock in, just continuing the good slate pretty much every Saturday, or every Saturday, every week. And as always, hey, I understand some people's budgets are frozen or things are in a little bit of a flux. Hey, don't let that be a barrier. Send me an email, joe.trinsey@gmail.com. Tweet at me at Volleycast, whatever it is. And we'll figure out, a way to make it work. All right. Hope everybody's doing well. And let me know what you think of this. Let me know if you have any questions or any reactions to this, and I can answer them in a follow-up podcast or a post or whatever. All right, that's it for the Volleycast today.